The alarm clock's metallic shriek cut through the December darkness at 5:30 a.m., jolting 17-year-old Tommy Morrison from dreams of college acceptance letters and escape routes from small-town Wisconsin. He reached out from beneath the pile of quilts his mother had heaped on his bed the night before and silenced the clock with the practiced precision of someone who'd been getting up before dawn for his job at Kowalski's hardware store. December 31st, 1967, New Year's Eve. The day that would either launch him toward the future he'd been planning since 8th grade, or remind him why boys from families like his didn't get to dream too big. Tommy pulled himself from the warmth of his bed and padded across the cold hardwood floor to the window. The glass was covered in ice crystals, so intricate they looked like nature's own stained glass, beautiful and forbidding in equal measure. Through the frosted pane, he could see his father's 1962 Ford pickup truck buried under snow, with only the antenna and part of the windshield visible above the white drift that had accumulated around it during the night. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his breath forming a small cloud even inside the house. The radio had been calling for cold weather all week, but this was something else entirely. The official temperature reading was minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit, but with the wind that had been howling since midnight, it felt like the surface of an alien planet designed to test the limits of human survival. From down the hall came the sound of his father stirring in the bedroom he'd once shared with Tommy's mother. Patricia Morrison had died 3 years earlier, lung cancer that no amount of fighting could beat, leaving behind a 17-year-old son with straight A's and college dreams, and a 43-year-old mill worker who'd been slowly drowning in grief and responsibility ever since. Tommy Morrison was the first person in his family's history to be accepted to college. The University of Wisconsin had offered him a partial academic scholarship based on grades that his teachers called exceptional, and his father called a waste of time that won't put food on the table. The scholarship covered tuition, but room and board would cost money the Morrison family didn't have. Money that could only come from Tommy's job at the hardware store, his father's overtime shifts at the paper mill, and a collection of small sacrifices that added up to the difference between staying in Green Bay forever and escaping to something bigger. Which was why, on the coldest morning in Wisconsin's recorded history, Tommy Morrison was planning to spend 8 hours standing outside Lambeau Field watching the Green Bay Packers play the Dallas Cowboys for the NFL championship. Not because he could afford tickets. Season tickets cost more than his father made in 2 months, and even single-game tickets were beyond their budget. But because Eddie Kowalski, his boss at the hardware store, had made him an offer the day before, that seemed too good to be true. "You work New Year's Eve morning," Eddie had said, counting out Tommy's weekly pay with hands permanently stained by machine oil, "and I'll pay you double time for the whole day. Plus I'll close the store at noon, so you can get to the game." Double time meant $16 instead of 8. $16 was 2 weeks of lunches, or a month of bus fare, or the difference between buying used textbooks and going without. For a kid trying to scrape together every penny for college, it was a fortune. The only catch was that Eddie expected him to represent the hardware store at the game. "You go out there and you cheer loud enough for both of us," he'd said. "You show those Dallas boys what Green Bay spirit looks like." The problem was that Tommy couldn't afford tickets any more than his father could, but he'd figured out a solution that seemed reasonable at the time. He'd watch from outside the stadium, find a spot where he could hear the crowd and catch glimpses of the action, and experience the game in whatever way was available to someone with more determination than money. Now, looking out at conditions that appeared designed to kill anyone foolish enough to venture outside, the plan seemed less reasonable and more like a potential death sentence. "Tommy," his father's voice carried down the hallway, rough with sleep and the lingering effects of the cigarettes he'd been smoking since he was 15. "You up?" Yeah, Dad. I'm up. You see this weather? Hard to miss. Frank Morrison appeared in Tommy's doorway, wearing the same flannel pajamas he'd had since Tommy was 12. At 43, he looked older, the kind of aging that came from working physical jobs in all weather, from losing a wife too young, from carrying responsibilities that never seemed to get lighter. "You're not seriously thinking about going out in this," Frank said, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Got to work this morning. Eddie's counting on me." Eddie Kowalski's a fool if he thinks anyone's going to buy hardware supplies today, and you're a bigger fool if you think you're going to stand outside a football stadium in weather that could freeze a man solid. Tommy pulled on his jeans and the thick wool sweater his mother had knitted during her final winter. "It's the championship game, Dad. The Packers are going to the Super Bowl if they win. So, you can listen on the radio where it's warm. It's not the same." Frank Morrison studied his son with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle he'd been working on for 3 years. Since Patricia's death, Tommy had developed an intensity that sometimes worried his father, a drive to experience everything, to squeeze maximum meaning from every opportunity, as if he understood that life could change without warning. "Your mother would have my hide if she knew I was letting you risk your neck for a football game," Frank said. "Mom would understand. She always said some moments are bigger than being comfortable." It was true. Patricia Morrison had been the dreamer in the family, the one who encouraged Tommy's academic ambitions, who insisted that small-town origins didn't have to mean small-town limitations. She'd saved nickels and dimes in a coffee can hidden behind the flour canister, money that was supposed to help with Tommy's college expenses, but had instead gone to medical bills that accomplished nothing except bankrupting the family. She also said, "Some risks aren't worth taking," Frank replied. "This one is." Tommy finished dressing with the methodical precision of someone who'd thought through every detail. Long underwear, wool socks, thermal shirt, flannel shirt, heavy sweater, work pants, insulated coveralls borrowed from his father's winter gear, 2 pairs of gloves, thin liners under heavy leather work gloves, wool cap, scarf, insulated boots, rated for sub-zero temperatures. The preparation took 20 minutes, transforming him from a skinny 17-year-old into something resembling an Arctic explorer. When he finished, he could barely bend his arms, but every inch of exposed skin was covered. "You look ridiculous," Frank observed. "I look warm. You look like you're planning to climb Mount Everest." "Maybe I am." In the kitchen, Tommy started coffee with the same practiced efficiency he brought to everything else. The ritual was important, not just for the caffeine, but for the psychological anchor it provided. Coffee meant warmth, comfort, the promise that civilization could survive even the most brutal assault from nature. He filled his largest thermos, a heavy steel model that his father used for winter construction jobs. The coffee was strong and black, steaming hot and rich with the promise of warmth to come. He added packets of hand warmers to his pockets, along with a small emergency kit that included matches, a pen light, and basic first aid supplies. "You're really doing this," Frank said, watching his son's preparations with growing concern. "I'm really doing this. What if something happens? What if you get hurt?" "Nothing's going to happen. I'll stay warm, I'll stay safe, and I'll be back home before you know it." Frank Morrison poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table where his family had shared thousands of meals, where Tommy did homework while Patricia cooked dinner, where they'd held her hand during her final weeks when the cancer made eating impossible. "I know this game means something to you," he said carefully. "I know the whole town's excited, but what if the weather gets worse? What if you can't get home?" "I'll figure it out. I always do." "You're 17 years old, Tommy. You don't know everything." "I know enough." It was an argument they'd had in various forms since Patricia's death, Frank's protective instincts battling against Tommy's fierce independence, his need to experience life fully despite the risks involved. The boy had been forced to grow up fast, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to adults, and sometimes Frank worried that his son had forgotten how to be a kid. "Your college acceptance letter came yesterday," Frank said quietly. Tommy stopped his preparations and looked at his father with sharp attention. "What did it say?" "Full academic scholarship, room, board, tuition, everything." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. Full scholarship meant freedom. It meant escape from the mill jobs and limited horizons that had trapped every generation of Morrison men before him. It meant the chance to become something more than his circumstances. "Why didn't you tell me yesterday?" "Because I wanted you to focus on today. On staying alive in weather that could kill you." Tommy sat down across from his father, suddenly understanding the weight of what Frank had been carrying. The scholarship changed everything, removed the financial pressure that had been driving every decision, eliminated the need to count every penny and sacrifice every comfort. "This is why I need to be there today," Tommy said finally. "This might be my last chance to be part of something like this. Once I go to college, once I leave Green Bay, I'll never be this person again." Frank Morrison studied his son's face and saw something that reminded him painfully of Patricia. That same intensity, that same unwillingness to accept limitations, that same belief that life was meant to be lived fully regardless of the cost. "Promise me something," Frank said. "What?" "Promise me you'll come home. Whatever happens out there, whatever the game means to you, you'll come home safe." "I promise." At 7:30 a.m., Tommy Morrison kissed his father goodbye and stepped out into the most brutal cold he'd ever experienced. The air hit his exposed face like a slap, instantly numbing his cheeks and making his eyes water. The tears began freezing almost immediately, creating tiny ice crystals on his eyelashes that he had to brush away with numb fingers. The walk to Kowalski's hardware store was 6 blocks through neighborhoods that seemed abandoned to the elements. Most driveways remained unplowed, most cars stayed buried under snow. The few people he encountered moved quickly between heated buildings, bundled beyond recognition, and focused on covering ground as efficiently as possible. The hardware store was warm and bright, a refuge from the Arctic assault outside. Eddie Kowalski was already there, a thick-set man in his 50s, who'd been running the store since his father died 15 years earlier. "Morning, Tommy. You're either the toughest kid in Green Bay or the stupidest. Haven't decided which." "Little of both, probably." "You still planning to go to that game?" "Wouldn't miss it." Eddie studied Tommy with the expression of a man who'd seen enough young people make poor decisions to recognize one in progress. "You know they're calling this the coldest day in Wisconsin history." "I heard." "You know people could die out there today?" "I'll be careful." "Careful." Eddie laughed, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Son, there's no such thing as careful in weather like this. There's lucky and unlucky, and that's about it." The morning passed slowly, with only 3 customers brave enough to venture out for emergency supplies, rock salt, emergency candles, and extra batteries for radios. The conversations were brief and focused, everyone understanding that prolonged exposure to the elements was dangerous. At 11:30, Eddie counted out Tommy's pay, $16 in cash, more money than he'd ever held at one time. "You sure about this game?" Eddie asked one final time. "I'm sure." "Then you represent us well out there. You show those Dallas boys what Green Bay's made of." Tommy left the hardware store at noon and began the 2-mile walk to Lambeau Field. The temperature had dropped even further during the morning, and the wind had picked up to the point where it felt like a physical assault with every step. But as he walked, thermos of hot coffee warming his hands through thick gloves, Tommy Morrison felt something he'd never experienced before, the electricity of being part of something historic, something that would be remembered long after the cold faded and the pain became just a story to tell. He was 17 years old, he had a full scholarship to college, and he was about to witness the greatest football game ever played, even if it killed him. By the time Tommy Morrison reached Lambeau Field, his coffee had cooled from steaming hot to merely warm, and he could feel the cold working its way through his multiple layers of protection despite his careful preparation. The walk had taken 45 minutes through neighborhoods that looked like abandoned Arctic outposts, and he was beginning to understand why his father had looked so worried. The area around the stadium was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Despite conditions that should have kept any rational person indoors, hundreds of fans had gathered, moving like Arctic explorers preparing for expedition. Cars crept through parking lots that had become treacherous skating rinks, their occupants emerging in so many layers of clothing they looked like walking sleeping bags. Tommy found his way to the small hill on the east side of the stadium where older kids from his high school had told him you could catch glimpses of the field if you positioned yourself correctly. The spot offered limited visibility into the stadium itself, but excellent acoustics for crowd noise and public address announcements. He wasn't alone on the hill. 3 other figures had already claimed positions, bundled beyond recognition, but clearly committed to enduring whatever the day might bring. As Tommy approached, one of them called out in a voice muffled by scarves and wind, "You got a death wish, kid." The speaker was a man in his 30s, built like someone who worked with his hands for a living. Despite the brutal conditions, there was humor in his voice, the camaraderie of shared foolishness. "Maybe," Tommy replied, settling into a spot where he could see between the stadium supports. "You?" "Definitely. I'm Eddie Kowalski. That's my nephew Mike over there, and the frozen statue by the fence is Pete Zielinski." Mike Kowalski turned out to be about Tommy's age, a senior at East High School who'd driven his father's truck to the game despite having his license for only 6 months. Pete Zielinski was older, maybe 50, with the bearing of someone who'd seen enough hard winters to know what he was getting into. "You bring coffee?" Mike asked hopefully, his teeth already chattering despite the early hour. Tommy held up his thermos. "Full pot, still hot." "Thank God. Mine froze solid on the drive over." "Froze? Already?" "Truck wouldn't start. Had to park 8 blocks away and walk. By the time I got here, my coffee was slush." Tommy unscrewed his thermos cap and poured coffee into his metal cup, watching steam rise for perhaps 3 seconds before the Arctic air killed it. The liquid was still warm enough to provide comfort, and when he took his first sip, he felt heat spread through his chest like medicine. "Game doesn't start for 2 hours. Pete announced, consulting a pocket watch that he'd somehow managed to keep warm enough to function. "Think we'll make it?" "We better," Eddie replied. "I didn't come this far to quit before kickoff." The conversation was punctuated by constant movement, stamping feet, flexing fingers, adjusting scarves and hats in an ongoing battle against the relentless cold. Even with all their preparation, Tommy could feel the temperature working its way through his defenses, searching for vulnerabilities. "You kids are crazy," Pete said, but there was admiration in his voice. "When I was your age, we had more sense than to stand outside in weather like this." "When you were our age, they didn't have championship games," Mike replied. "When I was your age, we had World War II. Weather like this was the least of our problems." Pete Zielinski had indeed served in the war, spending 2 brutal winters in Europe that had taught him everything he needed to know about cold weather survival. But even his experience hadn't prepared him for conditions this extreme. "This is different," he admitted. "This is nature trying to kill us for sport." Around them, the scene was becoming increasingly surreal. The parking lots were exercises in winter survival, with cars struggling to start and fans sharing emergency supplies. Those lucky enough to have tickets moved carefully toward the stadium entrances, bundled in so many layers they could barely walk. Tommy poured himself another cup of coffee and noticed that it was cooling faster than he'd expected. The metal cup was drawing heat away from the liquid at an alarming rate, and even the insulated thermos was struggling against the brutal ambient temperature. "How cold do you think it really is?" he asked. "Radio said -13, Eddie replied. "But with this wind, it feels like -40 or worse. Cold enough to kill us?" "Probably, but we're tougher than we look." The bravado was undercut by the reality of their situation. They were four people who'd chosen to expose themselves to conditions that meteorologists were calling unprecedented, armed with nothing but determination and thermoses of coffee that were already losing the battle against the elements. "Why are we doing this?" Mike asked suddenly. "Really? Why are we risking frostbite to watch a football game?" It was a fair question, and one that Tommy had been asking himself since leaving the hardware store. The rational answer was that they were young and stupid, caught up in the excitement of a historic moment without fully understanding the risks involved. But the real answer was more complicated. "Because it matters," Tommy said finally. "This game, this team, what they represent, it matters in a way that goes beyond football." How so? Tommy thought about his college acceptance letter, about the scholarship that would let him escape the limitations that had trapped every generation of Morrison men before him. He thought about his mother's dreams and his father's fears, and the weight of being the first person in his family's history to have real choices. "The Packers are like us," he said. "Small town, working class, not supposed to be able to compete with the big cities and big money. But they're here anyway, proving that character matters more than resources. And we're here to witness it," Mike added. "Even if it kills us," Eddie said with grim humor, "especially if it kills us." By 12:30, with kickoff still an hour away, Tommy's coffee had cooled to lukewarm, despite the insulated thermos. He was beginning to understand that he was fighting a losing battle against physics. No amount of preparation could completely protect against conditions this extreme. "Field's going to be brutal," Pete observed, somehow tracking activity inside the stadium through a combination of crowd noise and informed speculation. "Turf's frozen solid, like concrete. Players are going to get hurt bad on that surface." "Lombardi won't care," Eddie said with certainty. "You know what he always says. Football is meant to be played in weather like this. It separates the men from the boys." Easy for him to say. He's got a heated sideline. The crowd was building despite the conditions, though Tommy noticed that many of the cars in the parking lots were already leaving. People were arriving, taking one look at the brutal reality of spending 3 hours in Arctic conditions and deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. But those who stayed demonstrated the same stubborn determination that had brought Tommy and his companions to their exposed hillside. These were the hardcore faithful, people who understood they were about to participate in something legendary. "My dad thinks I'm crazy for being here," Tommy said, taking another sip of cooling coffee. "Is he right?" Mike asked. "Probably. But sometimes you have to be a little crazy to do something worth remembering." At 1 o'clock, Tommy attempted to pour more coffee and noticed something troubling. The liquid came out slowly, thick and reluctant, with ice crystals swirling through it like snow in a globe. His coffee, his lifeline to warmth in this frozen wasteland, was beginning to freeze. "Look at this," he said, holding up the cup for the others to see. The 3 older men stared at the coffee with fascination and horror. Ice crystals were indeed forming in the dark liquid, creating patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "How long has it been since you poured that?" Eddie asked. "Maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes for hot coffee to start freezing solid?" Apparently, they stood in contemplative silence, each man processing the implications of freezing coffee. If liquid could solidify this quickly in these conditions, what did that say about their ability to survive 3 more hours of exposure? "We should probably be worried about this," Pete said unnecessarily. "Should we leave?" Mike asked, though his voice carried no conviction. "Can't leave now," Tommy replied. "Game's about to start." The truth was that none of them could imagine abandoning their posts at this point. They'd invested too much, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to quit before kickoff. The idea of retreating to warmth and safety, while rational, felt like betrayal of something larger than their personal comfort. At 1:15, the stadium began showing signs of real activity. Maintenance crews were making final preparations on a field that looked like a skating rink, and players were emerging for warm-ups that seemed more like exercises in survival than athletic preparation. "Kickoff in 15 minutes, Eddie announced. Tommy took another sip of his coffee and realized with growing alarm that it was now more slush than liquid. The ice crystals had multiplied and thickened, creating a substance that was halfway between drink and frozen dessert. "Boys," he said quietly, "I think we might be in more trouble than we realized." But even as he said it, even as he watched his coffee slowly transform from liquid to something approaching solid, Tommy Morrison knew he wasn't going anywhere. This was his moment, his chance to bear witness to greatness, his opportunity to prove that 17-year-old kids from working-class families could endure whatever the world threw at them. The Green Bay Packers and Dallas Cowboys were about to play for the NFL championship in the most brutal conditions in the history of professional football. And 4 people who couldn't afford tickets were going to watch from a frozen hillside, sharing body heat and gradually freezing coffee and the kind of determination that sometimes looked indistinguishable from insanity. The real test was just beginning. The opening kickoff was met with a roar from the stadium that seemed to shake the frozen ground beneath their feet, but by the middle of the first quarter, Tommy Morrison realized that his coffee had achieved the consistency of a chocolate milkshake left too long in a freezer. When he tilted the cup, the liquid moved reluctantly, ice crystals swirling through the brown mixture in patterns that would have been fascinating under different circumstances. "Holy shit," Mike Kowalski muttered, his words barely recognizable through lips that had taken on a disturbing blue tinge. "I can't feel my toes anymore. Literally cannot feel them." The 4 of them had unconsciously moved closer together over the past hour, sharing body heat in a primitive huddle that spoke to the desperation of their situation. Eddie stood in the middle, his thick frame providing a windbreak for the others, while Pete had produced an army surplus blanket that he'd wrapped around all of them like some kind of Arctic poncho. "Dallas just scored," Eddie announced, somehow managing to track the action through a combination of crowd noise and his small transistor radio. 7-0, Cowboys. The news hit their small group like a physical blow. After enduring an hour of Arctic conditions just to reach this moment, hearing that the Packers had fallen behind felt like a personal betrayal. The Cowboys weren't supposed to score first in Green Bay, not in weather that should have favored the home team. Tommy attempted another sip of his coffee and found that it now required actual effort to swallow. The liquid had thickened to the point where it was more slush than drink, and the taste had become bitter and metallic from the cold. Still, it provided some psychological warmth, and he forced himself to consume the icy mixture. "This is impossible," he said, staring at the cup in disbelief. "Coffee doesn't freeze like this." "Everything's impossible today," Pete replied, his words coming out in puffs of vapor that crystallized and fell like tiny snow. "The whole damn day is impossible." Around them, the landscape had transformed into something from another planet. The continuing snowfall had reduced visibility to perhaps 50 yards, turning Lambeau Field into a ghostly outline that appeared and disappeared as the wind shifted the falling snow. Cars in the parking lot had become abstract sculptures, buried under drifts that made them look like hills with antennas sticking out at odd angles. "Radios reporting frostbite cases at the hospital," Pete announced, pressing his transistor radio closer to his ear. "Saint. Mary's has seen 15 people so far today, and we're only halfway through the first quarter." "Frostbite from what?" Mike asked. Walking to their cars, waiting in line to get into the stadium, one guy got frostbite on his face just from the walk from the parking lot to the entrance. Tommy tried to pour more coffee from his thermos and discovered that it came out in thick, sluggish streams that began solidifying before they reached the cup. The entire contents of the insulated container were gradually transforming from liquid to something approaching solid. "How long we been out here?" Mike asked. 4 hours, Tommy replied, checking his pocket watch with fingers so numb he could barely manipulate the small mechanisms. 4 hours, and my coffee's turning into a popsicle." The admission hung in the frozen air like a confession. For the past hour, each of them had been conducting private calculations, measuring their remaining endurance against the time they'd committed to spend in these conditions. The mathematics were not encouraging. "My dad's probably worried sick," Mike said. "He keeps asking me why I do stuff like this, why I put myself through it when I could just listen on the radio." "What do you tell him?" Tommy asked. "That some things are bigger than being comfortable. That some moments demand you show up even when it costs you something." "You believe that?" Mike was quiet for a long moment, stomping his feet in a futile attempt to restore circulation. "I used to. Right now, I'm mostly trying to remember why it seemed important." The truth was that all 4 of them were questioning the wisdom of their decision while simultaneously being unable to imagine leaving. They'd invested too much, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to abandon their posts now. The game had only just begun, but they'd already endured conditions that tested the limits of human tolerance. "Packers just tied it up," Eddie announced. 7-7, Bart Starr to Boyd Dowler. The stadium erupted with the kind of noise that seemed to warm the air around them for just a moment. Tommy felt a surge of something, hope, vindication, pure, stubborn joy that helped push back against the physical misery for a few precious seconds. But the celebration was brief. The cold was relentless, and it was beginning to affect them in ways that went beyond simple discomfort. Mike had developed a slight tremor that he tried to hide by keeping his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Eddie's responses to questions were coming several seconds delayed, as if his brain was processing information through molasses. Even Pete, the toughest of them all, had developed a slight slur in his speech. "Boys," Tommy said carefully, "how are we doing, really doing?" "I'm fine," Mike insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "My feet have been numb for an hour," Eddie admitted. "Can't feel them at all anymore." "Should we be worried about that?" Tommy asked. "Probably," Pete replied honestly. "This isn't normal cold. This is survival cold." They were entering territory that none of them had experienced before. This wasn't the manageable cold of a Wisconsin winter, the kind of weather that required extra clothing and caution, but remained within the realm of normal human experience. This was something else entirely, a test of survival that was revealing the limits of their endurance in real time. "Field conditions are getting worse," Eddie reported, listening to halftime commentary through increasing static. "Players are having trouble staying upright. The footing is treacherous." Through the swirling snow, they could catch occasional glimpses of the stadium, now looking like a ghostly outline that materialized and vanished as the wind shifted the precipitation. Inside, 48,000 people were demonstrating the same stubborn determination that had brought Tommy and his companions to their exposed hillside. "Second quarter," Tommy announced, checking his watch again. "We're halfway through the first half." "Halfway," Mike repeated. 2.5 hours to go." The mathematics of endurance were becoming increasingly dire. They'd been exposed to brutal conditions for 4 hours, and their bodies were showing signs of strain that went beyond simple discomfort. How much longer could they realistically expect to survive in temperatures that were challenging the limits of human tolerance? Tommy took another sip of his coffee and found that it was now more ice than liquid. The substance in his cup had achieved the consistency of soft-serve ice cream, and when he swirled it, he could hear ice crystals clinking against the metal. "Look at this," he said, holding up the cup for the others to see. "It's not even coffee anymore. It's like frozen coffee soup." The 3 others stared at the cup with the kind of fascination normally reserved for natural disasters or traffic accidents. The transformation was complete enough to be genuinely disturbing, liquid becoming solid in real time, civilization surrendering to the raw power of nature. "How cold does it have to be for that to happen?" Mike asked. "Colder than any of us have ever experienced," Pete replied grimly. "Dallas just scored again," Eddie announced. 14-7. Don Perkins ran it in from the 1-yard line. The mood among their group darkened further. The Cowboys weren't just surviving Green Bay's brutal conditions. They were thriving in them. Everything about this day was challenging their fundamental assumptions about home field advantage, about the power of environment to favor those who understood it best. "This isn't how it's supposed to go," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion and cold. "Nothing about today is how it's supposed to go," Pete replied. But even as they struggled with the reality of frozen coffee and a losing team, none of them made any move to leave. They'd crossed some invisible line where retreat felt more dangerous than persistence. They were committed now, for better or worse, to seeing this through. "Third quarter coming up," Eddie announced. Tommy looked at his thermos and realized with growing alarm that the entire contents had now solidified. When he turned it upside down, nothing came out. Not a drop. The steel container now held what was essentially a coffee-shaped block of ice. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at the thermos in disbelief. "What?" Mike asked. "It's all frozen, every drop. The whole thermos is solid ice." The 4 young men stared at the thermos as if it were an alien artifact. The coffee had been steaming hot when Tommy filled it 6 hours earlier. Now it was completely solid, transformed by conditions that seemed to defy normal physics. "If coffee can freeze that fast," Mike said slowly, "what's happening to us?" It was a question none of them wanted to answer directly, but the implications were clear. Their bodies were fighting the same battle as the coffee, using up resources at an unsustainable rate to maintain core temperature. How long before they crossed the same threshold from functional to frozen? But even as they contemplated their situation, the crowd noise from inside the stadium reminded them why they'd chosen to endure this punishment. 48,000 people were demonstrating the same stubborn determination, the same refusal to surrender to circumstances that seemed designed to break the human spirit. "Third quarter," Tommy said, raising his cup of frozen coffee in a toast to their collective stubbornness. "Let's see what we're really made of." The Green Bay Packers were trailing 14-7, but there was still half a game to play, and 4 teenagers who'd never set foot inside Lambeau Field were going to bear witness from their frozen hillside, sharing body heat and solidarity and the kind of determination that sometimes looked indistinguishable from temporary insanity. The real test was just beginning. The third quarter began with the Dallas Cowboys leading 14-7, and Tommy Morrison realized with crystalline clarity that his coffee had transformed from a beverage into what could only be described as a frozen artifact. When he held the cup up to what little light filtered through the storm, he could see the perfect preservation of the swirl patterns from when he'd last stirred it, frozen in time like an ancient insect trapped in amber. "Time's running out," Mike Kowalski muttered, but his words were so slurred they were barely recognizable as English. The senior from East High had been declining steadily over the past hour, and now he stood swaying slightly, his eyes unfocused and his breathing alarmingly shallow. Around them, the storm had reached what seemed like biblical proportions. The wind was no longer gusting, but maintaining a steady, brutal assault that drove snow horizontally across the landscape. Visibility had been reduced to perhaps 15 feet, turning their small hill into an island surrounded by white nothingness. "Mike," Tommy said urgently, shaking his friend's shoulder. "Mike, stay with us." Mike's eyes opened slowly, but they seemed to have trouble focusing. "I'm okay," he said automatically, though his voice carried no conviction. "No, you're not," Tommy replied. "None of us are okay. We're all hypothermic, and if we don't get help soon, we're going to be in serious trouble." But even as he said it, Tommy knew that getting help was no longer a realistic option. The storm had isolated them as effectively as if they were stranded on a mountain peak. Emergency vehicles couldn't navigate the parking lots, which had become impassable seas of snow. The nearest landline was blocks away, through conditions that made walking suicidal. They were on their own, committed to enduring whatever came next. "Packers are driving," Eddie announced, though he was having difficulty holding his radio steady enough to maintain reception. "First and 10 at the Dallas 40. Through the howling wind and swirling snow, they could hear the crowd noise building inside the stadium. 48,000 people were somehow finding the energy to cheer despite conditions that should have rendered them mute with cold. The sound was both inspiring and surreal, evidence that human beings could transcend their physical limitations when something truly important was at stake. Tommy looked at his thermos again, still amazed by the completeness of the transformation. The coffee hadn't just cooled or thickened, it had become a solid block of ice, so hard that when he tapped it with his knuckle, it rang like a church bell. The metal container itself had frosted over until it looked like it had been stored in a freezer for months. "This is impossible," he said for the 4th time that day. "I mean, physically impossible. Coffee doesn't freeze like this under normal circumstances." "Nothing about today is normal," Pete replied, though his words came out thick and slow. "This whole day, it's like nature decided to see how much 4 idiots could take before they came to their senses." The truth was that they were experiencing weather conditions that challenged the basic assumptions of human survival. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees, but with the wind chill, it felt like minus 50. These were conditions that could kill exposed humans in less than an hour, yet they'd been enduring them for nearly 6 hours. "Green Bay just scored!" Eddie shouted suddenly, his voice cracking with excitement despite his condition. 14-14, Bart Starr to Chuck Mersane. The stadium erupted with the kind of noise that seemed to shake the frozen ground beneath their feet. Even through their exhaustion and hypothermia, all 4 young men felt the electricity of that moment, the sudden shift in momentum that could change everything. "They're fighting back," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "In these conditions, they're still fighting." But as the 3rd quarter progressed, Tommy began to notice changes in his companions that went beyond simple discomfort. Mike was swaying more noticeably now, his eyes unfocused. Eddie's responses to questions came several seconds delayed, as if his brain was processing information through frozen molasses. Even Pete, the toughest of them all, had developed a worrying tremor in his hands. These were signs Tommy recognized from health class discussions about hypothermia, and the recognition filled him with genuine fear. They were entering territory where pride could become a life-threatening liability. "Boys," he said carefully, "maybe we should think about getting somewhere warm, just for a few minutes." "You kidding?" Mike's words came out thick and slow. "Miss the 4th quarter?" The greatest game ever played? Won't matter if we're dead, Tommy replied. I'm fine, Eddie insisted, but when he tried to adjust his position, he stumbled slightly. Tommy looked at his three companions, a hardware store owner's nephew, a high school classmate, and a war veteran, and saw them losing a battle against an enemy that didn't care about determination or willpower. His coffee was now completely solid, transformed into what looked like a brown ice sculpture. When he held it up and let the weak winter light filter through it, he could see the patterns and swirls frozen in perfect detail, a monument to the impossibility of their situation. But the fourth quarter was about to begin, and neither team had quit. The Cowboys were still fighting, still believing they could win a championship in the most hostile conditions imaginable. The Packers were drawing energy from the frozen ground beneath their feet, from the crowd that refused to abandon them, from the knowledge that this moment would define their legacy. "Fourth quarter," Tommy announced, checking his watch with fingers so numb he could barely see the hands. 15 minutes to go. "Dallas just scored again," Eddie reported, his voice now badly slurred. 17-14, field goal. The mood among their group darkened. They were so close to the end, yet the Packers were behind again, and Tommy's body was sending increasingly urgent signals that it was approaching the limits of what it could endure. "I can't feel my feet at all," Mike said suddenly. "Like nothing. They could be gone and I wouldn't know it." "Same here," Eddie added. "Everything below my knees is just gone." Tommy tried to move his own feet and realized with alarm that he was experiencing the same sensation. His extremities were shutting down, his body prioritizing core temperature over the survival of fingers and toes. "We're in real trouble," he said quietly. "How much trouble?" Pete asked. "The kind where people lose body parts or die." The words hung in the frozen air like a death sentence. They'd pushed their bodies beyond reasonable limits, and now they were facing the consequences of their stubbornness. But even acknowledging the danger, none of them made any move to leave. "Green Bay's driving," Eddie announced. "They're at the Dallas 30, 25, 20. The crowd noise was building to an impossible crescendo. Tommy could feel the tension even from outside the stadium, the collective will of 48,000 people demanding that their team find a way to win in conditions that seemed designed to make victory impossible. "Touchdown Green Bay!" Eddie screamed, his voice breaking with emotion. 21-17, Boyd Dowler in the corner of the end zone. The roar from the stadium was tremendous, a wall of sound that seemed to warm the air around them for just a moment. Tommy felt tears forming in his eyes, whether from emotion or the wind, he couldn't tell, and realized they were freezing on his cheeks almost immediately. "They did it," Mike whispered, swaying dangerously. "The sons of bitches actually did it." But Dallas wasn't finished. With time running out, the Cowboys began their own desperate drive, moving the ball with the urgency of men who understood this might be their only chance at greatness. The cold was affecting both teams equally now, reducing professional football to its most basic elements, willpower and heart. "Dallas is moving," Eddie reported, though the radio was crackling with increasing static. "They're at midfield, now the Green Bay 40. Tommy found himself thinking about his college acceptance letter, about the scholarship that would let him escape the limitations that had trapped every generation of Morrison men before him. He thought about his mother's dreams and his father's fears and the weight of being 17 years old with frozen coffee in his hands, watching history unfold in conditions that might kill him. "They're in the red zone," Eddie announced. "Dallas is threatening to score." The crowd noise had taken on a desperate quality now, 48,000 people willing their team to make one more stop, to deny the Cowboys the championship that seemed within their grasp. Even from outside the stadium, even through the howling wind, Tommy could feel the collective tension of that moment, but then, impossibly, the noise changed. The desperate pleading transformed into pure explosion of joy, the kind of sound that could only mean one thing. "Interception!" Eddie screamed. Green Bay picked it off. Herb Adderley. The four young men on the hillside embraced, despite their hypothermia, despite their exhaustion, despite the very real possibility that they might not survive the next hour. They had witnessed the turning point, the moment when character triumphed over circumstance, but the game wasn't over. Green Bay still had to maintain possession, still had to run out the clock against a Cowboys team that wouldn't quit until the final whistle. With less than 5 minutes remaining, the Packers faced third down and goal from the Cowboys' 1-yard line. A field goal would extend their lead, but leave time for Dallas to score. A touchdown would effectively end the game, but it meant running one more play in conditions that had already proven treacherous. The tension was unbearable. Inside the stadium, 48,000 people were on their feet, despite the brutal cold, screaming encouragement to their team. The players themselves were operating on pure adrenaline now, their bodies pushed far beyond normal limits. "They're going for it," Eddie whispered, and despite his condition, there was awe in his voice. The crowd noise built to an impossible crescendo. Tommy found himself holding his breath, his frozen coffee cup forgotten in his numb hands. Around him, 3 other young men who had endured conditions that should have killed them waited to see if their sacrifice would be rewarded. And then it happened, the moment that would become legend. Bart Starr took the snap from center Ken Bowman and followed guard Jerry Kramer into the end zone behind a quarterback sneak that covered 18 inches but felt like 18 miles. The crowd erupted with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. "Touchdown!" Eddie screamed, his voice breaking completely. "Bart Starr! The Packers win! 28-17! The 4 young men on the hillside collapsed into each other, crying and laughing and shouting in voices hoarse from cold and emotion. They had done it. They had endured 6.5 hours of conditions that challenged the limits of human survival. They had watched hot coffee turn to solid ice. They had pushed their bodies beyond reasonable limits, and they had witnessed greatness. As the final seconds ticked off the clock and the celebration began inside the stadium, Tommy Morrison looked at his frozen coffee cup one last time. It was completely solid now, a brown block of ice that would never again be liquid. But it had served its purpose. It had been his companion through the most extraordinary day of his young life. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible through lips that had gone completely numb. "We actually did it." "Did what?" Mike asked, swaying dangerously. "We were here. When history was made, we were here to see it." The storm was still raging around them, and they were all showing serious signs of hypothermia. Getting home safely would require careful planning and immediate action. But they had accomplished something that would define the rest of their lives. They had proven that 17-year-old kids could endure extraordinary circumstances when something truly important was at stake. As they began the slow, careful process of making their way back to civilization, supporting each other, sharing what little body heat remained, moving with the deliberate caution of people who understood they were still in danger, Tommy carried his frozen coffee like a trophy. It was evidence of what they'd endured, proof of the price they'd paid to witness greatness. Years later, when people asked him about the Ice Bowl, he would tell them about Bart Starr's quarterback sneak and Vince Lombardi's leadership and the incredible toughness of both teams. But mostly, he would tell them about the day his coffee froze solid, and he chose to stay anyway, because that's what separated the boys from the men, because that's what made legends. Because at 17 years old, with a full scholarship in his pocket and the whole world opening up before him, Tommy Morrison learned that some moments demand everything you have to give, and sometimes If you're very lucky, you discover you have more to give than you ever imagined.